An FBI director is pulled over without cause, but when she questions the stop, the officer's tone shifts, and within moments, a gun is drawn. What follows is a shocking abuse of power that exposes the dark reality of unchecked authority. Will justice prevail? Or will this be another case buried in silence? Will justice be served? Or will this be another case swept under the rug? Stay with me, because this story is one you won't forget. Before we get into it, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy meaningful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Mia Ross, the director of the FBI's Special Investigations Unit, had spent her day leading a major case, coordinating with agents and overseeing operations. She was used to pressure, she was used to stress, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen. The sound of a siren cut through the peaceful evening, followed by the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her first instinct was confusion. Why was she being pulled over? She hadn't broken any traffic laws. Her seatbelt was fastened. Her speed was within the limit. She used her turn signals. It didn't make sense. Mia glanced over at the rearview mirror again, and then slowly pulled her car to the side of the road, just as she had done countless times before. She reached over and turned on the headlights, a habit she had developed after years of living as a woman of color in America, just to make sure everything was clear, just to make sure nothing went wrong. She didn't fear the law, but sometimes the people who enforced it weren't as fair as they should be. A tall, white police officer approached her car. Mia rolled down the window, keeping her face calm, professional. She wasn't intimidated. She had been in high-stress situations her whole life. She could handle this. "Good evening, officer. How can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady. The officer, whose name tag read Officer Larson, looked at her for a long moment. His eyes filled with something that Mia couldn't quite place. After a beat, he snapped out of his gaze. "License and registration," he said, his tone colder than it should have been. Mia frowned. "Can you tell me why I was stopped?" Larson hesitated for a moment as if searching for a reason. "You looked suspicious," he finally said. Mia's brow furrowed, but she kept her voice calm. "Suspicious? I'm sorry, officer, but I don't think looking suspicious is a valid reason to pull someone over." Larson's eyes narrowed and his tone shifted. "Are you questioning my authority? Just hand over your papers." Mia remained calm, but now a spark of irritation rose in her chest. "I know the law, officer, and I know I have the right to ask why I was stopped. If you don't have a legitimate reason, I'm not handing over anything." The officer's jaw tightened. The tension in his eyes was clear. He wasn't used to being questioned. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Larson said, his voice rising. "Hand over your papers now, or I'll have to take further action." Mia didn't move. She simply stared at him, her calm gaze unwavering. She had seen this before. The aggression, the assumption. She wasn't just any driver. She wasn't someone he could intimidate. "I'm not refusing to cooperate," she said firmly. "I'm simply asking that you follow procedure. I don't think this stop is justified, and I'm not handing over my papers until you can prove it's legal." For a long moment, Larson just stood there, glaring at her. Then, with a huff, he pulled out a flashlight and shone it in her face, as if looking for something to pin on her. "Are you carrying anything illegal?" he demanded. "Weapons? Drugs? Maybe something else hidden in the car?" Mia's hand tightened on the steering wheel. She could feel the weight of the situation shifting. The officer wasn't just stopping her for a routine check. He was trying to provoke something, anything, that would give him a reason to escalate this further. But Mia wasn't going to give him that. Not tonight. Not ever. "I'm not carrying anything illegal," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And I suggest you don't insult me by implying that I am." The officer's face turned red with anger. He stepped back, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. "People like you are always trouble," he muttered under his breath loud enough for Mia to hear. "You'll regret this." Mia kept her hands on the wheel. She knew she couldn't let her guard down. She had trained countless agents on how to handle situations like this. The key was to stay calm, no matter what. It didn't matter if he was the one holding the badge. She wasn't going to let him push her around. "Officer," she said, her voice steady but resolute, "I am a law-abiding citizen, but if you continue to behave like this, I will report you for your misconduct. I have every right to be treated with respect, just like anyone else." The officer's face twisted in anger. But Mia wasn't finished. "You're not going to intimidate me, Officer Larson. If you want to escalate this, fine. But you're the one who's going to regret it." Mia kept her gaze locked on him, unwavering. She was prepared for whatever might come next. But what she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that this encounter was about to turn into something much bigger than a simple traffic stop. Something that would shake not just their lives, but the entire justice system. The officer's hand hovered over his gun, and for a brief moment, Mia thought he might draw it. She knew how quickly things could spiral out of control, how easily a single moment of panic could turn into a life-threatening situation. But she wasn't going to let that happen. She couldn't afford to make a wrong move, not with a police officer like Larson, not with everything on the line. "Don't make me do something I'll regret," Larson spat, his voice low and dangerous. Mia's eyes didn't waver. She was still calm, still in control. "Officer," Mia said, her voice unwavering, "you're escalating this unnecessarily. I'm asking you to follow the law. You have no reason to threaten me, and you certainly have no reason to point a weapon at me." He ignored her. Instead, Larson leaned closer, his voice shaking with anger. "I don't care who you are. You're just another civilian, and civilians like you don't get to lecture me. I'm the one with the gun." Mia knew then that this wasn't just about the stop anymore. It wasn't about a simple misunderstanding or a traffic violation. Larson had made it personal. He had already decided she was an enemy, someone to control, someone to intimidate. The moment he started talking about civilians like you, she felt the sting of it. It wasn't just the way he looked at her, it was the assumption in his words, the complete disregard for her position, for her life. In that moment, she realized how many times she had seen this kind of behavior. The arrogance, the assumption of superiority, the belief that some people didn't deserve the same treatment as others. Mia could feel her own anger rising, but she kept it contained, knowing that any slip would give him what he wanted, an excuse to take things further. "Officer Larson," she said, her voice cool and steady, "if you continue down this path, you will be the one who regrets it. You have no right to threaten me, and I will not stand by and let you abuse your power." Larson sneered, his hand tightening on the grip of his gun. "I'm in control here," he snarled. "You think you're above the law? You're not. I'm the one in charge, and if you don't cooperate, things are going to get a lot worse for you." Mia's mind raced for a solution. She knew this wasn't just a power struggle. This was about control. This was about dominance, about a badge and a gun being used to instill fear. And in that moment, Mia understood. He wasn't going to back down unless she forced his hand. "I'm not going anywhere," Mia said firmly. "I'll stay right here until you lower that weapon and treat me with the respect I deserve." Larson's face was turning red. His temper was rising, and Mia could see he was on the edge. His hand was still on the gun, but now it was shaking slightly. "You really think you can talk to me like that?" he spat, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "I'll show you what happens when you defy me." Mia's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't show it. She couldn't afford to show fear. She couldn't let him see her hesitate. "Do you want to escalate this?" she asked, her tone icy. "Because I'll remind you, officer, that I am recording everything, every word, every movement. If you do anything rash, it will be documented." For a moment, Larson froze, his expression flickering between anger and confusion. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected her to be so calm, so composed, in the face of everything he was throwing at her. Mia didn't wait for his reaction. She reached for the phone mounted on her dashboard and pressed the record button. "I'm recording this entire encounter," Mia said, her voice clear and sharp. "If you don't lower that gun, I will report you for every single infraction you've made tonight. You're abusing your power. You're not above the law, and I will make sure this goes public." Larson's eyes darted between Mia and the gun in his hand. He was visibly shaken now, his confidence slipping away. but the anger in his eyes remained. "Think you can scare me with a camera?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't care about your little recording. You don't get to call the shots here." He pulled the gun from its holster, the cold metal glinting in the fading light. He pointed it directly at Mia through the window, the barrel aimed right at her. "Get out of the car now," he commanded, his voice now a growl. Mia's hand stayed on the steering wheel, her eyes never leaving his. The tension was unbearable, but she refused to flinch. She refused to let him see her fear. "I'm not getting out of the car," she said calmly. "You have no reason to make me, and I won't follow an unlawful order." Larson's face twisted with rage. He was losing control now. His grip on the gun tightened. "I said, get out of the car," he repeated, his voice louder now, more desperate. Mia knew that this was the tipping point. One wrong move from her, one misstep, and this could turn deadly. But she wasn't going to let that happen. Not tonight. Not because of a man who had let his power go to his head. She kept her voice steady. "I will not obey an unlawful command. I'm not leaving this car until you give me a valid reason. Until you give me something other than your threats." Larson didn't back down. Instead, he took a step closer. The gun still aimed at her, his finger now resting on the trigger. "You really think you can get away with this?" he sneered. "You think you're going to walk away from this without consequences?" Mia stared at him, her face a mask of calm. "If anyone is going to face consequences, officer, it's you, because you've crossed a line tonight. And when the truth comes out, it will be you who pays for it." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what was to come. Mia wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly, anyone who had ever been the target of discrimination and abuse of power. She wasn't going to let this moment go without a fight. In the stillness of the night, Larson seemed to hesitate for the first time, and that hesitation was enough to set the stage for what would happen next. The standoff between Mia and Officer Larson stretched on, the air thick with tension as they stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Larson's hand was still tightly gripping the gun, his knuckles white against the metal. His chest heaved with each breath, but it wasn't fear that had him shaking. It was anger, frustration, and a simmering rage that had built up over years of unchecked power, of people like Mia who refused to bow down. Mia's resolve remained unshaken. "Put the gun down, officer," Mia said, her voice steady but firm. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when it mattered most. Larson's gaze flickered briefly to the recording on Mia's dashboard, then back to her. For a moment he seemed to consider her words. Maybe it was the camera. Maybe it was the calmness in her voice. Maybe, for the first time in this encounter, he was questioning his own actions. But then his face twisted again, the anger resurfacing. "You think that little camera's going to save you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think the law's on your side? I make the law here, not you." Mia wasn't scared, but she knew how quickly things could spiral out of control. She knew what could happen if Larson continued down this path. Her mind raced with possibilities, but her face remained impassive. The more he raged, the more control she felt she had. "I'm not scared of you," Mia said, her tone unwavering, "and I'm not scared of your gun." The officer blinked as if the words had hit him harder than he expected. His grip on the gun loosened for a fraction of a second, just enough for Mia to notice. But it was enough. That moment of hesitation could be her only chance to de-escalate this before it went too far. Mia took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving Larson's. She knew she had to make her move now. "Officer Larson," she said calmly, "I'm not your enemy. I'm just asking you to do the right thing. Let's walk away from this without anyone getting hurt." For a brief, terrifying moment, Larson's expression was unreadable. His eyes burned with a cold fury, but there was a flicker of something else too. Doubt, maybe, or fear. "You think I'm going to listen to you?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Mia kept her posture steady, her hands still resting on the wheel, the engine of the car humming quietly beneath them. "I'm not asking you to listen to me," she replied. "I'm asking you to think. Think about what this will mean for you. Think about what happens if you pull that trigger." Larson's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching around the gun's grip. "You really don't get it, do you?" he spat, taking a step forward. "You think I care about what happens to me? I don't care. I'm in control. Not you." Mia took a moment to gather her thoughts. She knew there was a chance she could talk him down. She wasn't naive. This situation was precarious. But she had seen enough to know that sometimes people in positions of power were just as afraid as the people they aimed to control. Maybe Larson wasn't as sure of himself as he pretended to be. "Then let me remind you, officer," Mia said, her voice calm but unwavering. "You are not above the law, and you do not get to make decisions for other people just because you wear a badge. That's not how it works." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Larson hesitated again. His eyes flickered away from hers, shifting back to the gun, then to the car door, and for just a second, Mia saw something break in him. He wasn't as unshakable as he wanted to appear. "I didn't want it to be like this," Larson muttered, almost to himself. "I didn't want to go this far." Mia kept her voice level, not showing any sign of victory because she knew this wasn't over yet. "Then don't," she said. "Put the gun down, and we can both walk away from this." Larson stood still, his breath quickening, eyes darting around as though the weight of his decision was finally hitting him. For a moment, Mia could almost see the man behind the badge, the man who was just trying to survive in a world that had taught him to hold on to power at all costs. But then, as if his resolve snapped back into place, Larson took a step back. His face hardened, and the fury returned to his eyes. "I'm done talking," he snapped, his voice shaking with the effort to keep control. "Get out of the car." Mia's heart sank. She knew this was a critical moment. She knew the longer this dragged on, the higher the stakes would get. But she couldn't back down. Not when she was so close. "Officer, please," she began. But Larson was already reaching for the door handle. In that moment, Mia knew it wasn't going to end without a confrontation. Whatever happened next was going to change everything. Larson pulled open the door with a violent yank, and in a split second, Mia could feel the rush of adrenaline flooding her system. He moved fast, too fast, and before she could react, he grabbed her arm, yanking her out of the car. The cold night air hit her like a wave as she stumbled to her feet. She caught a glimpse of the gun, still pointed in her direction, but now there was nothing she could do to stop him. For a moment, the world slowed down, and Mia realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. This was a confrontation, and in that confrontation, only one person could come out on top. She could hear Larson's breath coming in quick, ragged bursts, his frustration boiling over into anger. Mia's mind raced, but there was nothing she could do now but play her part and hope the right thing happened. In the distance, the sound of sirens began to approach, but they were still too far away to save her now. The clock was ticking, and there was only one thing Mia knew for sure. Things were about to get much worse before they could get better. Mia's heart raced, but her mind was strangely calm as Officer Larson's grip tightened on her arm, pulling her further away from the safety of her car. The cold night air hit her skin, a sharp reminder of how quickly this had all escalated. The weight of the gun in Larson's hand was undeniable, but Mia wasn't going to let fear control her. She had made it this far by keeping a level head, and now was no different. Larson's eyes were wild with fury, his hand shaking as he pointed the gun toward the ground, almost as if it had a life of its own. "You think you're so clever, huh? You think you can talk your way out of this?" His voice was a harsh rasp, full of anger and regret, but also a hint of something else, something that Mia couldn't quite place, something that made him seem almost lost. Mia didn't flinch. "I'm just trying to make sure no one gets hurt," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. "Including you." For a split second, Larson's eyes narrowed, his mind seemingly caught between anger and doubt. His gun wavered slightly in his grip, and in that instant, Mia saw a glimpse of the man behind the badge, the man who had once believed in doing the right thing, the man who, at some point, had lost his way. "Shut up," Larson snapped, shaking her arm harder. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through." His voice cracked with emotion, and for the first time, It wasn't just rage Mia heard. There was pain there, too. Pain he had carried for far too long. Mia's mind raced as she tried to understand. Was this anger truly about her? Or was it a reflection of his own inner turmoil? She couldn't afford to make this personal. She had to stay focused. I don't need to know everything about you, officer. I just need you to listen. Larson pulled her closer to him, forcing her to take a few hesitant steps toward the open road. The distant sirens were growing louder, but still they felt too far away to be of any real help. His breath was hot on her face now, his words coming in ragged bursts. You don't know what it's like to carry this weight, he muttered, almost to himself. To have everyone expect you to be perfect, to follow every rule, to make the tough calls every damn day. You don't know how it feels to lose control. Mia could see it now. This wasn't just about a simple traffic stop or some misplaced authority. This was about years of suppressed frustration, the burden of power, and the consequences of a man who had been trusted to protect and serve, but had instead allowed his own sense of control to slip away. I don't need to be perfect, officer, Mia said softly but firmly. None of us do. We just need to do the right thing when it counts. Right now, that means letting go of that gun. Larson's eyes flickered as if he hadn't expected her to speak with such empathy. For a moment, he seemed to waver, his shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight of her words was finally starting to sink in. But then the sirens grew louder, the flashing lights from a squad car lighting up the darkened street. Larson's grip on Mia's arm tightened, and in that moment, everything became clearer to her. He wasn't going to back down. Not without a fight. Mia could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, but she kept her voice even. Please, don't do this, she said, meeting his eyes. Think about your future. Think about what's at stake here. This doesn't have to end badly for you. It doesn't have to end with you in handcuffs. Larson's jaw clenched, his eyes darting back to the approaching police car, then to the flashing lights, then back to her. He looked like a man caught between two worlds, one where he was in control and one where he was losing everything. The tension was unbearable. Mia felt the seconds ticking by like hours. She could see the way Larson was breathing now, shallow, quick, almost like he was suffocating under the weight of his own decisions. I didn't ask for any of this, he muttered again, his grip loosening just slightly. I just wanted to do my job. I never thought it would come to this. Then stop it, Mia replied. Stop now before it's too late. For a moment, Larson just stared at her, and Mia thought, just for a second, that he might be listening. But then his hand moved again, faster this time, and in a split second the gun was pointed up, aimed directly at Mia. The fear and regret that had seemed to soften his expression vanished, replaced by a cold, rigid stare. Mia didn't panic. She'd learned long ago that panic never helped anyone. Her mind was clear, and her thoughts were sharp. She knew how close this was to being the end. Just put it down, Mia said, her voice steady. Please, you're not a villain, officer. You're not a criminal. You're just a man who made a mistake, and you can fix that. But only if you put the gun down now. Larson didn't move for a long moment. His finger was on the trigger, but something in his eyes flickered. For a second, Mia thought she could see a shift, like he was finally realizing that the power he held wasn't control, but fear. Fear of losing everything. Fear of the consequences of his own actions. Then, just as it seemed like Larson might make a choice, something unexpected happened. The sound of police cars screeched to a halt behind them. The loud thud of doors slamming, footsteps pounding on the pavement. Officers rushed forward, shouting commands. Mia froze for a second, her heart in her throat. This could go one of two ways. Either Larson would comply or he would lash out in one final desperate move. And then, with one single action that no one could have predicted, Larson dropped the gun. His entire body seemed to sag with relief as he fell to his knees, his hands raised above his head, defeated. Mia's breath caught in her throat as the weight of the moment hit her. It wasn't over, but for the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself a breath of hope. The police rushed to take Larson into custody, but Mia wasn't watching them. She was watching him, A man who had once believed in his power, now broken by his own choices. She couldn't help but feel a small pang of pity for him. What had happened to Officer Larson didn't just affect him, it affected everyone. It was a reminder of how fragile power could be and how easily it could slip away when we let our emotions take control. As the officers led Larson away, Mia stood there for a moment, still processing everything that had just happened. The sirens, the flashing lights, the sudden, terrifying escalation. It was over for now. But Mia knew that the scars, on both sides, would remain long after the incident was forgotten. And that was the truth. Power, control, and fear. None of these things were permanent. They were illusions that could disappear in an instant, leaving only the consequences of our actions behind. Mia wasn't sure what would happen to Larson, but she knew that this moment would stay with her forever. The truth was simple. Sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought with guns or strength, but with the courage to let go and make the right choice.